starting with the senior scholar of the Franke College of Business, Ron Gunderson. Ron's been here longer than the Economic Outlook Conference has been around. So apparently he got his PhD when he was 8. But he's one of my predecessors. He served as dean. He's professor of economics here, has a BA from Augustana College, an MA from Penn State, and a PhD from the University of Nebraska. And so he's going to talk to us about regional economic issues.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is good to be back. Good to see a full house. And Craig isn't quite right. I didn't come here prior to the first Economic Outlook seminar, but I was here by the second one. Came in 1977, and I've probably participated in 34 or 35 of these in the past, and different locations, different venues around town, certainly different size of the crowds, and it's really interesting to see how things have evolved and all the changes that have taken place. And as President Cheng said, there have been a lot of changes. A lot of these have been good, a lot of them not so good. There's been certainly change locally, nationally, internationally. And at the same time, while we do need this cooperation and we need these partnerships, it's fun to do, but there's also some challenges, right? Because one thing that doesn't change very much is it seems as if there's always these entrenched items, entrenched views, and so on that make it difficult for people to get along. And it wouldn't have to be that way, but you know, I'm reminded of a jogger. He was jogging through the park, and he came upon a man walking a dog. And everybody likes dogs, so he says, "Does your dog bite?" And he said, "No, my dog doesn't bite." So he reaches down to pat the dog on the head, and the dog bites him. And he says, "I thought you said your dog doesn't bite." And he says, "That's not my dog. It's not my dog." You know, that's the kind of thing that we see too much often of what's going on, that you don't get the cooperation sometimes that you see. And sometimes it gets a whole lot worse. One of the advantages of being here so long is that you can tell some of the same stories that you told years ago and hope nobody remembered them. But I remember once telling a story related to an article in Time magazine in 1992. So almost 25 years ago. And what was happening then is there was a lot of stories, a lot of things written about what life would be like in the new millennium. After the year 2000, you know, in the days we are now, what would things be like? And a number of issues came up, but then and now and at other times, people have often wondered, you know, are we the only ones in the universe, or perhaps are there other people out there as well? And he was saying that there were the possibility of folks out there, but maybe they didn't want anything to do with us. He said there's perhaps civilizations out there that are far, far more advanced than we are. And they watch us, and they see us, and they don't respond. So he thought that while we hadn't been searching for extraterrestrial life all that time, all that long by 1992, that what if after 500 years of waiting, watching, and listening, there's still no answer? Does it really mean that we are alone? And he says, perhaps not. He says, because perhaps those civilizations out there have an intergalactic code that they're not going to associate people with people who are different from them, and that we have to change in order to become part of the intergalactic society. And he said there is perhaps out there somewhere beyond the orbit of Pluto a sign that says, "Don't feed the bears." Very likely that we're not doing as well as we perhaps should. And it's a bad thing when even the space aliens don't want much to do with us. So how are we doing? Well, you have a lot of surveys out there. Surveys, people, you ask them on the street. 2 out of 3 people say we're on the wrong road. And this guy apparently took the wrong road. we have a lot of concerns among a lot of people and a lot of issues regarding how we would like things to be. So today, you just ask the people, and they're not feeling very good about society many times. They're just not feeling too good. And you hope things are going to be better in the future, but I'm not necessarily sure that things are going to be all that great in the future either. If you look at this, it's probably a weird day coming up if you see this in the morning. And also, a lot of things can change here, but we hope for some more good things as well. But to move to something that I feel is very, very important is part of the reason why we don't necessarily feel so good about what's going on is represented by this particular chart here, which goes back to the post-World War II days, almost 70 years now. This Federal Reserve data here and the up and down the lines here represent the annual rate of change in output, or the gross domestic product in the society for each year compared to the previous year. And you can see that we've had our ups and downs. We've got the business cycle. This is something that's part of life. And the very light lines that you maybe can't see, the vertical bars there, are the periods of recession during the last 70 years. And we've had 11 different recessions during that time. So hopefully you can see those. But after each recession, it's been typical for the society, not only ours but other countries, to race out of that depression or recession. In other words, the growth comes out fairly strong. You sprint out in a way, and you can see way back in the early 1950s, that increase was up about almost 15%. And then for several of the next recessions in the 60s, 70s, and so on, as we came out of those recessions, the annual increase in the rate of growth was about 7.5%. But then if you go to the very right-hand part of the slide, way over here, you can see that that increase has only been about 2.5% in the last recession. And in other words, about a third of what it was in some of the earlier recessions. But the thing that struck me as I looked at this is it's not just been this last recession where the economy hasn't sprinted out of its depths. Go back to about 1981 or so, about 2/3 of the way across the chart, and you'll see that none of those recoveries have been as strong as they were in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. That is, that the rate of growth in the first year out of recession hasn't been that 7.5%. It's been lucky to get to 5%. So something might have changed structurally in the economy as long ago as 35 years, not just the recent change that might explain this. So what else has gone on in the society during that time? Well, one of the things you can look at is the federal debt. And those of you that follow the federal debt know that historically, up until the 1980s, we generally balanced the budget. Not every year, but over the business cycle. And debt didn't increase very much except during wartime periods when debt would go high, quite high. But it was fairly low, and as you can see from the slide here, it was pretty low in 1980. And then the rates started to skyrocket. That is, we have been spending a whole lot. Now, part of that is, because of changes in society that we've needed to. But we've gone ahead and we've continued to spend a lot. But at the same time, you can also see that the tax collection, this is income tax collection at the federal level, has also changed considerably during that time. The income tax was first initiated in this country in 1913, and the rate was fairly high. It was, 80% or so, about 80%, and then it dropped quite a bit prior to the Depression, and then it was raised then for most of the lifetime of those of us in this room up until the 1930s, up until the 1980s. It was about, it was the highest rate, the highest marginal tax rate was 91% for a while, and then it dropped to 70%. And then with the Tax Recovery Act in about 1982, that rate was dropped to, into the 30s, and today, it's gone back and forth a little bit between about 36 and 39% on the margin for the highest rate. So what has happened is the spending has not only remained the same, but it has increased, and the tax rates have fallen rather substantially. And you wonder, the question that I would pose or leave you with is, you wonder if that particular change in policy is in part responsible for our massive decline in the rates of growth in the GDP, and how long can that continue? I'm going to skip that one. Basically, if you look back to one of the famous economists in the Nixon and the Ford years, Herb Stein, he said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And that's pretty insightful, right? It will stop. So in my usual way of looking at things, I'm thinking that we can't cut back on a lot of government spending. I mean, a lot of people would like to think we can, but if you look at what's happened in the last few decades, we've had a whole lot more that we've had to spend for the Department of Homeland Security. We've had to increase military budgets. We've got the demography and the age statistics of our population working against us. You've got more and more people who are about to retire, fewer people paying for folks that are going to need more health care, more Social Security, more. The ideal of reducing expenditures is really pie in the sky, and since I'm not going to run for office, I'm going to suggest that we need to increase the marginal rate of taxation back to 70% prior to what Ronald Reagan did when he dropped it. So I'm blaming our bad attitude these days largely on President Reagan and folks that have followed his theology, so to speak, over the last 35 years. As I said, I'm not running for office. Now, at the same time, though, I will indicate that we do need to do a lot of other things. The corporate income tax probably should just be, it should go away. I mean, to compete nationally, internationally, our rates are too high, and I'm not sure that you don't end up with a lot of these extra taxes just being passed on to the customers anyway. So while the individual income tax needs to be raised, and raised a lot, the corporate tax could be completely discarded and go away. A lot less in business regulation. I mean, those of you that are in business, I mean, I'm sure you get very frustrated with all the regulatory rules that respect or address almost every aspect of your business. Those have got to be reduced at the same time. But the only way to increase our economy in terms of getting growth back on track, I think, is to get more investment, get the businesses involved in saying this is what we need to do, and then a lot of the other things start to take care of themselves, and then we might be able to lower that income tax rate back down to about 65% again in the future. Okay, well, it's not all bad news. Sometimes I ask, is there sufficient time to buy a house before things get really bad? And the answer is yes. Yeah, we can buy a house. It's not too late. If you look at the Flagstaff numbers, you can see that our single-family home sales in Flagstaff, if you look at, say, the last 7-8 years, are starting to come back and increase to levels where we may have 900 homes sold by the end of the year here. That we're getting back up to 778 now over the first 10 months, and if that continues, we'll have over 900, and you can see over the last several years we haven't even been close to that. So it represents a pretty good increase. These numbers, by the way, are not just the city of Flagstaff, but in the Flagstaff region, which is the numbers I get from Ann and the others at RE/MAX Peak Properties. Also the single-family home sales, you can see here those increases have been coming back as well, up to about 355,000 now for the average home sale. So it's not a bad time for sellers to start putting the houses back on the market. And the other item that I'll talk about, and then we'll kind of pick up some of the other stuff maybe in the panel, is what about the revenues for the city of Flagstaff? And once again, the second bar from the right is the one that looks at the end of the previous fiscal year. The one here, we're about 10%. In other words, we had a double-digit increase in Flagstaff revenues over the last year. And then the current 2 months, I've only got 2 months of data for the current year, which is the first 2 months of the latter part of this summer. It's even higher. So I'm kind of looking at some pretty good increases there. It's been spread about quite a bit. Auto sales, you see, they've come up a little bit from last year. The bed, board, and booze is down a little bit, but it's generally, I think, because of some of the process of collections, it'll pick up. Construction, while you can see it all over town, there's a lot of construction. The second bar from the right indicates how much it had increased from the previous year. We haven't seen a whole lot of revenues coming in the last couple of months, but we're going to see those come back too. So there's a lot of things that are still going on that are pretty good in much of this area. Okay, I think I'm up to time. Thank you.